כמו שראיתם, לכנס הזה יהיו שני חלקים. בחלק הראשון תהיה הרצאה של ברון מוריס גלסמן, שאנחנו, מי ששמע אותו אתמול יודע שזו צפויה להיות הרצאה מאוד מעניינת. ואחר כך אנחנו רוצים להשאיר מקום לדיון פתוח, זה יהיה אפילו דיון אינטימי. ואחרי זה, החלק השני, אנחנו רוצים ככה לראות מה אנחנו יכולים לקחת מהדברים או מהתובנות שבאות אלינו מאנגליה לדיון שלנו כאן על כלכלה של טוב משותף. אז אילון.
אז בוקר טוב. זה נראה לי קצת מאוד פורמלי במפגש שהוא יכול להיות בלתי פורמלי, אז בואו ננסה לעשות את זה ככה. אני חושב שכדאי לנו לנצל את ההזדמנות של קבוצה דווקא אינטימית שאנחנו יכולים גם כן להגיע לדיון. אז אני רוצה להגיד שני דברים, אחד יותר לכיוון של שחרית ככלל, ואחד יותר לכיוון של מוריס, ברון גלסמן, ואני אעבור לאנגלית, כי ממילא המושב הראשון יהיה באנגלית, כך שגם כן מוריס יכול לעקוב אחרי הדברים שאני אומר גם כן. I want to say something. All of you, I believe, are familiar with Shachrit and our work on some level. And so I won't do an introduction to our work, but I do want to talk a little bit about why Moriss has been important to Shachrit's work from a distance, but also more and more from close up, and why the economic piece is so central to how we see what needs to be done. I often say that that the issue of Israeli society has two heads to it. Ron knows this a little bit in this conversation. One is the one that is more obvious, I think, in our public sphere, although one of the things that's interesting, I think, is that it is less pronounced, at least, in the British public sphere. And maybe Baron Glasman will correct me about that. But one is, we call it the tribes, the different groups of Israeli society. How are we going to make some sense in a society that that the old dominance of the liberal, Ashkenazic, secular, greater Tel Aviv crowd has lost its dominance? I like to say some people mourn that. They stole from us the country, and some people celebrate that. But it's a reality, and I think our president has done a good job in getting that message out there in a very clear way, and figuring out what stories can we tell about who we are that can build something that on the one hand allows each one of the communities of Israel to have its pursuit of the good and who we are and what we need to be, etc. And yet builds some web of connections that allows a common good to develop. So call it the identity piece of our futures. But there's another piece that is intimately connected to that one and that needs to be integrated in a more full way. And that's the economic piece. When we look at Israeli society, and we had social protests in this country in 2011 that hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets, tent camps that were set up all over the country. There's a deep sense, especially among many of the identities in Israeli society that are not part of the kind of dominance in the traditional dominance in Israeli society in the public sphere, right? Achad Ha'am Street, the high-tech world, those places. The places that are on the fringes of that, both sociologically, geographically, etc. There's a sense that the economy is not working for them and they've left behind. That there's an economy that's serving a certain class of the society and does not at all figure out a way of how to bring other people along with it. And that problem is deep, structural, political, And in many ways, the questions of identity and the questions of economics are completely interrelated to one another. And I think part of the struggle is to figure out in what ways those things are integrated with one another, and how do we build a way of thinking about politics that fully takes into account both of those stories. The stories of, on the one hand, an economy that has devastated, people's lives, even exactly in Israel, where we think of ourselves as the high-tech nation and the startup nation, and the ability to, right? There's a reality that's up here, and there's a reality that exists in a very different place for most people's lives and how they live. And those people's lives are the same places where we have an identity question, an identity crisis of how do we build a society that allows all those voices in the society to be a fully part of it. So you can see that those two stories are fully connected to one another, and yet in the ways that we tell them, and I'll say it in a very personal way, in the ways we tell them in Shachrit, we have not yet figured out how to tell it in a way that's fully integrated and that brings the power of both of those stories into a politics that can make a difference in Israeli society. So I say all of that in order to introduce Mouris, in order to say the things that I get from Mouris personally and from his work that has bridged, I think, a number of those questions along the way. Mouris and I, Baron Glasman and I'll go back to Mouris, share, I think, a lot of things, even though we lived in parallel universes. He started his work, and for those of you who know Shacharit's work, it matches up quite closely, as an academic. First of all, I started up in the Jewish community. That's an important kind of piece of the story within the Jewish community in England on the East Side. For those of you that says something to, became an academic with a strong social consciousness, as befits that, and slowly made his way into issues of social change that were always there intellectually, probably were also there in earlier parts, but made his first claim on that in being central to an organization called London Citizens. And London Citizens is important because it was an attempt to organize on a local level, primarily, and I imagine you're going to talk about this maybe on some level, between primarily faith groups, churches, mosques, interestingly enough, less so synagogues, interesting because it says something about the Jewish community and where it is, around issues that eventually developed into questions having to do with a living wage in London. So you hear the story of a story that's matching up these two things. On the one hand, going into different sociologies and empowering them and involving them, and on the other hand, focusing it around the questions of economics and economic, security, economic prosperity, economic safety, as it were, around these different pieces around it. Through the field of community organizing, that Shachrit is now working with the same people that they work with in London Citizen. Arnie Graf is going to be coming here next week to continue work that we do in community organizing, doing very similar work. It's to trying to kind of mobilize, or organize people as to where their hearts are, where their needs are, and how do we make those things and translate them into kind of social change on a local level and eventually on a national level. And from there, Mouris became a life peer in the House of Lords. I've learned that over that I got that right. In the House of Lords for the Labour Party. After having began something that's called Blue Labour, which is an attempt to give a political face to these intuitions about the ways we reconnect to people and their lives, and how that plays themselves out both in terms of who they are and what they bring to the table, and on the other hand, their economic interests in the deep sense of it, of how the economy works for them, and how that plays out in terms of their identities and who they are and who they're trying to be. And that's the work that he does. And just as a last sentence, I think that we need, in Israel, to start a conversation that goes beyond the conversation that I think we're stuck in many ways, of the massive neoliberal model, right, a model, you know, that there are various terms around, but, you know, what I said, a model that works for a thin group of people and has left so many people behind in the model of what it is. It's not just a model, it's an approach to people, it's an approach to how it thinks about people, it's an approach to how it thinks about economics. So there's that on the one hand. And on the other hand, the road less traveled, as it were, is a social democracy model. Think of Shelley Yakimovich in the last elections, 2 elections ago. Think about the desire to bring back the welfare state as a model, in the economic terms, a Keynesian economics, which we hear often in terms of kind of the alternative that's presented. And there's a reason why the welfare state social democratic model failed in Israeli society, and it is not only because of the dominance of the neoliberal economic model and the globalization that went along with it. It's not only because of those things. And I think that people in their lived lives actually know that, and know that somehow the alternative that's being put out for them does not speak to who they are and what they're looking for, both in the language that it uses, but also in actually the policies that it puts out there. And I think what we need to do is think about what a alternative model is, not because, you know, we have this kind of image of what economics should look like, but rather because we've reconnected to people and what they need and what they say that they need and how they understand their lives, and to allow an economics to develop from those places. And I found in Blue Labor's work, in Morris's work, in the work of trying to understand what different possibilities can be, something that has been eye-opening in terms of possibilities of reframing this and building an approach that allows these two worlds to come together and to build something that's powerful, that can speak to the hearts and minds of Israelis. So that's my overblown introduction to Morris. The last 2 things I'd like to say is that it's been, I was in London a week ago, so I've had a full dose of Morris over the last 2 weeks. We said we've had too much, we're going to end this tomorrow. So we've had enough of this. It's very sweet. So we had a full dose, and so I feel like we've been able to play out a lot of these themes that I was talking about on the one hand through this. And the second is that we watched, I abandoned him. You know, he's a Tottenham supporter in football, as they call it. And so we were at a bar last night watching the game. I abandoned him at his hour of need, which was when his team was up 2-0, but he knew that his team are losers with a kind of that, and so there is never a moment that you can rest. And in fact, the other team scored a goal right after I left, abandoning him, and but they pulled it out and they won 3-1, which he also predicted when we spoke. And so in that space, which I won't go into baseball and my own particular struggles over the last week as my team kind of fell apart in the last moments, very similar to Tottenham and kind of those struggles. But in that place of the struggles to build something, and that knowing that those things are always frail and always tentative, I'm really thrilled to hear what Morris has to tell us and to talk to us about. So there you go.
Thank you, Elon, and Boker Tov, everybody, and very good to be here. The last time I spoke on a table with flowers on it was in Moscow before the fall of communism. There's something about social science departments all over the world that look like Stalinist sort of police departments, and so it's very comforting in that way to be here. And really, it's just to share a reflection, let you know what I'm up to. I'm very interested to hear where you are and what you think. So I'll just overview. So as Elon mentioned, for years, so as an academic, you can understand, I completely lost interest in theory. You know, it was too boring, too repetitive. And got very involved in community organising issues about labour organising in particular, and this idea of living wage and organising particularly immigrant communities people who in London had been contracted out, so the cooks, the cleaners, the security guards, and what I noticed was that the unions weren't organising them, in fact couldn't relate to them at a fundamental level, and realised that they had much more trust in their churches and their mosques, so did a strange kind of labour organising through that. So I'm willing to talk about, but what I realised after about 10 years, which were very good years, was that the biggest problem facing labour thought, socialist thought, left thought, you know, we could have a conversation about that, was the lack of a political economy, was a real lack of a, you know, one of the rules of organising is the price of political success is a constructive alternative. At some point people turn and say, well, what would you do? And what I noticed is that when that happened, suddenly we began to talk in a strange language about exogenous and endogenous growth, and infrastructure was always a very big word, never a good word to use on a date, you know, with someone. I think we need more infrastructure. And then I had this, you know, to carry on with that analogy, I realised that we'd entered the world of Viagra economics, that our only answer was more a stimulus package, was always a stimulus package. Now, obviously, you know, there's a role for a stimulus package, particularly in certain areas of Tel Aviv and London where you can buy them. But the problem is, what do you do when the drugs wear off? And always the answer was, and this is absolutely the level of the double think that we'd got to, well, then everything will be fine. When the drugs wear, you know, the more you spend, the more you save, the more debt you're in, the better. Funnily enough, people who hadn't been to university didn't really accept this argument at all. So, you know, just to say we've, you know, I know that you went through a very similar experience to us politically, you know, lots of words, lots of thoughts, lots of thinking that maybe Labour would win the election, but it didn't. And absolutely the same in England. There was this absolutely widespread consensus among social science graduates and journalists that Labour were going to win the election. But, you know, blue Labour is partly Tottenham, you know, because they play in blue, and I couldn't support the red team anymore. That was, you know, one thing. But the other thing is this, you know, Elon said, "You've won this game," he said to me last night when he left, and I just thought, he's really, really not deeply embedded in the Labour movement. He doesn't know what it means to really pluck defeat from the jaws of victory, which is our best thing. So, you know, just to say that this is a really profound issue that is absolutely related to what Elon was saying about the two sides of this. Work matters hugely to people. It's an absolutely fundamental part of their life. The way that we give meaning and value and respect to the dignity of labour is a huge part of how we actually politically organise. But in fact, we've lost the language of the ethics of work, or, you know, the work ethic. We've lost the language of skill, sacrifice, courage, bravery, ingenuity, creativity. Very interestingly, and I'll come to it, those ideas are still alive, for example, in the Israeli army, but we don't use them when we talk about the economy. And we've retreated to a state position, so, you know, so our biggest problem is that we lack a constructive political economy. Related to that problem is, very strangely, we've never really got over a model of the war economy as a way of organising the economy. I think that was fundamentally the case here, but it was certainly the case in Britain after the Second World War. You know, we'd defeated fascism. It was a very centrally organised economy. The idea was that the state could run an economy, and that the political economy was that partnership between welfare, state spending, we're back to, you know, infrastructure, education, and the economy as as an integrated system. So in many ways, I think that we haven't really got beyond, you know, you could say Brezhnevism, but really it was Stalinism as a fundamental form of economic organisation. And that this breakdown has been a long time in coming. So nothing has been, you know, there's two things that are, you know, hugely predicted and never happened. The first is that Labour will win an election, and the second one is that neoliberalism has been defeated. We hear this time and time again. It's been defeated, it's been discredited, it's however many articles emerge, however much data is put into the mix, funnily enough, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever to what goes on, and we have to understand that beyond resorting to a kind of false consciousness argument about the people. It's possible that we're in a lot of trouble and don't see it. You know, sometimes I feel connected to Labour that you've been rejected in a relationship, and you say to the person who's rejected you, you say, we've changed, and they go, okay, and then you begin repeating exactly the same things that led them to reject you in the first place. So we've got to really have a change of narrative and a change of tone. So to go to the fundamental things, I'm working with the chief economist at the moment at the Bank of England, a guy called Andy Haldane, who I do recommend that you read, who we met along the way, and he said, Morris, I get it, that there is no, that the orthodoxy is incorrect and the alternative is incorrect, but how do we develop a distinctively different political economy? So we're working on that, and I just wanted to share with you sort of where we've got to. But maybe the best place to start in terms of is to recognise there was a very important, but people don't really talk about it anymore, very important debate in Vienna in the 20s called the socialist calculation debate, which I think turned out to be hugely important. And on the one hand were exactly the socialists and the left. You could say definitely the kibbutz movement was there. The leadership of the high-tech industries and the Israeli army were certainly present. It was Kautsky and Rosa Luxemburg and all those people around, and the people who were against them were seen as mad, and they were people like Hayek and von Mises. There was this debate about socialist calculation. And essentially the socialist argument was, which is still, I think, the dominant argument, that if you developed a computer that was big enough and complex enough, and you could process all the data into the computer, you could calculate people's needs. That you had a means of calculating, and you could organize an economy not on the basis of competition, not on the basis of a price system, not on the basis of what they used to call the insane duplications of functions, as if having two shops was somehow superfluous, and not on the basis of competition, but on the basis of a calculation of human need. And von Mises, and following him Hayek, argued that this was a fantasy and a misunderstanding of the economy. And the first thing they argued was that future wants, future needs are by their nature unpredictable. So, I'm old enough to remember, do you remember a world before mobile phones? I know it's very difficult to remember that world, but just to let you know that the state did not predict. That if you remember, the state was working on these things, certainly it was the case in Britain, that were going to turn your oven on. Kind of like a bit like mad Shabbat time switch, a Shabbat time switch that was going to regulate your heating, and you could do it from anywhere. Meanwhile, it turned out that people wanted to have loud conversations on public transport with each other indefinitely, but we didn't know that. And the essential point that Hayek and von Mises were making, and what became known as the Austrian school were making, was that the price system is a discovery process. It's a means of information being communicated about what people want that is a priori unknowable. Now, they didn't dispute that there was such thing as human need, but what they understood was that there was a complex, decentralized system of information that was distributed through the price system that drove innovation and that discovered what people wanted. And what really hasn't been recognised, I think, is to what extent the Austrian school won that debate. Now, that was played out over many, many years, and we know what happened in the Soviet Union, and I sense, in a way, you know what happened here after, in that period, 48 to, what would you say, 75, 70, 76, where there was a much more centrally directed economy. The second thing about this socialist calculation debate was the centralization of the socialist argument that this was going to be administered and controlled through the state and through systems of state monopolies. And the Austrian school quite rightly drew, well, who's holding these people to account? And the answer was, well, this will be done democratically, but obviously within complex systems what you had was quite authoritarian systems with no form of worker representation. That was the really interesting thing. There was no form of worker representation in these forms of nationalized industries, which became simultaneously both corrupt and inefficient for obvious reasons, and ultimately subordinated to families. And one of the huge breaches of trust in the labour tradition is how Labour often used those nationalised industries as a way of employing their children. Just using them for political appointments and various things. Having put their lifetime into selfless political struggle, it was only right, I guess, that, they could have made a lot of money in business, but they chose to serve the people, so their children had to do something, I guess. So that was one of the ways that it works. So what I wanted to raise is that socialist economic theory really has not developed beyond, in its moderate form, Keynes, and I just want to talk about that for a moment. So a complete and exclusive emphasis on external stimulus, on a system of state macroeconomic management, with a very odd quirk that I would not blame Keynes for, which is that at least Keynes said that you should spend in a crash and save in a boom. We changed that and said that you should spend in a boom and spend in a crash. So that was what I meant by the Viagra economics aspect. It's really, once you get into it, you can't get out of it. And the logic of that is Greece. The logic of that is Greece, an economy that generates no value, really, at all, and yet feels completely entitled to ask for more and more money in order to continue, without any conception of how it will actually generate any value in its economy. And then obviously there's Marx. So the strange place that we find ourselves is that in terms of economic thought, really very, very little has changed since the 1930s. It's still, Keynesians are still, I believe, well represented in economics departments and are still making arguments for stimulus packages. Then you've got Marxists who say, well, that's a bit too moderate, and what we should really have is a state-based system of production. And then you've got what we call at various moments neoclassical. I don't know why we keep on calling them neo, but neoclassical, neoliberal, and really there's very little else, and given those choices, it's really unsurprising, given the obvious dynamism, creativity, innovative power, transformative power of a decentralized capitalist system, that when people ask themselves the fundamental questions, which they do, of how I'm going to earn a living, they go that way. How are we going to earn a living? Well, you know, we're going to go with a system that is at least dynamic, transformative, and you know, has some historical record of delivering, because of the bankruptcy of the other things. So I just wanted to give a background to that. At the last election, certainly in England, in Britain, it was the economic issue that ultimately did it. You know, people didn't trust Labour to run the economy, or they didn't really trust Labour with their money. But that was certainly related also to what Alon said earlier, which was a tin ear to. So we neither had a theory of a common life, nor how the economy could support a common life. That's another way of putting it. So the work that we're working on is definitely built on one of the guys who was present at that socialist calculation debate, Karl Polanyi, who wrote, I think, a very important book called The Great Transformation, which understood things in a slightly different way. And so just to begin with that, so what I think Polanyi correctly understood is that capitalism as an economic system puts an enormous pressure to turn human beings and their natural environment, so human beings and nature, to transform them into commodities. Now, there's only one problem with that system, is that human beings and nature are not commodities. I get criticised a lot in England on the left for working with faith communities. And my justification that I put to left-wing secular academics is, well, at least, you know, religious people do not think that the free market created the world. You know, that's at least, well, we can begin there, that there's some inheritance, some prior inheritance involved with that. That means that they do not view nature as a commodity, and above all do not view human beings. And yet the pressure to create land markets, food markets and labour markets does create this enormous pressure to commodify human beings and their natural environment. And what happens when you do that is exhaustion, is that you exploit people, you exhaust people. Now, the political logic of that, which we're now beginning to go onto the dynamics of in Europe, is that if there isn't a democratic and constructive alternative to a system of mass commodification, you're beginning to see that with resistance to the free movement of labour within the EU, on the restoration of state action in order to deal with that, then you will get forms of authoritarian populism, right-wing populism will emerge in order to preserve the most fundamental elements of society, people, and their natural environment that they lived in. So we work on the assumption that is the fundamental issue that capitalism raises, is how to resist the commodification of the person. But we have to add to that a second bit of thought that we've learned over the years since the socialist calculation debate, which is that if capitalism is a system that wishes to abstract things, to disembed them and disembody them and move them around without any interference, you know, that's the whole dream of, you know, a borderless world where people can move freely in search of wages and betterment, and where capital can have access to labour at better terms, because that's one of the problems, is if you don't have this movement of people, then it tends to be the case that labour negotiates better conditions, and that's of course market inefficient. So you know, that's our analysis of immigration. It's got nothing to do with multiculturalism. It's just in the interests of capital to have free movement of labour, because it undermines continually the ability of workers to resist their commodified condition. I think, Elon, you can see the connections between the political economy and the cultural forms. In fact, what we call this theory, and I'm really, don't want to get too involved, we call this a form of cultural materialism. That the economy is the way that we reproduce society, the way that we serve each other, the way that we use inherited skills to reproduce the conditions of a culture. And what capitalism represents is an attempt fundamentally to turn that, not from a cultural sphere, into an entirely monetized activity. So we begin with the work of Karl Polanyi, and then I just want to, just go into the problem, the way that we analyze the problems with Hayekian thought and the neos, shall we call them. And the problem with Hayek is that in his social theory, which is not uninteresting, he makes a distinction between sort of instinct on the one side, collectivism, the individual egotism, and collectivism, or what he calls atavism. But then there's a mediating thing called tradition that works in his social theory that brings those together. So tradition is an institutional form that mediates the pull of either excessive egotism or excessive collectivism, but he doesn't use any mediating term in his economic theory. So in his economic theory, there's either planned orders or spontaneous orders, and nothing in between. And sort of on the way, a few of us have discovered the virtues, and I know it sounds odd, but in terms of secular superior thought, the tradition that really engaged with work, that really engaged with tradition, which really engaged with all these things that neither Keynes nor Marx nor Friedman could understand: tradition, institutions, vocation, value, place, firms. You'll never have any analysis of those things. The middle area of economic activity was probably best described in Catholic social thought. So that was a bit of a difficult issue, that Catholic social thought actually had a concept of work as a vocation, work as an inherited tradition, and how do you reproduce labour value. It had an understanding of the importance of private property, it had an understanding of the importance of competition, but also it had an understanding of those institutions that embedded an economy and meant that it wasn't prey to the exploitation of the person and of nature, which of course in Catholic thought would be a defying of a sort of covenantal obligation, and would lead to the dehumanization of society. So just to say that issue of commodification is key. And then what we looked at, and the thing that we look at most, is how it was that this very strange system that came into West Germany after the Second World War proved to be of such durable economic importance. So just to say, after the Second World War, Britain went one way, we went the nationalisation way, we went the centralised economy way. We had all the problems of winning the war. We thought that the reasons that we won the war could be the basis of the peace. Germany went a very different way. So the way they went was, looking at the Great Depression and the reasons for the Great Depression, trying to guard against the emergence of a centralised state. They essentially brought in three fundamental systems that were quite unique, that turned into be a national system. The first was a system of regional banks. So one of the issues that we look at, one of Blue Labour's things is to always say Marvin Gaye's question of what's going on is more important than Lenin's question of what is to be done. You know, you've got to get some sense of what's going on before you, otherwise you get this endless activity and no action, if that makes any sense. That's how we put it. So you've got all these think tanks in England always producing policy papers that no one reads, that don't go anywhere. So one of the fundamental what's going on is a centralisation, is that capital centralises every bit as much as the state. The capital tends towards oligopoly and centralisation and has a natural tendency to go for the highest returns on investment, which tend to be speculative rather than rooted in manufacturing. So you have two tendencies under capitalism: increasing financialisation and then the concentration of capital. We obviously see that very strongly in the City of London. Very interestingly, in Germany, they went for a system of regional banks so that capital could remain in places. So you weren't allowed to lend outside of certain borders, and that took two forms. There were geographical form of local banks, and then there were sectoral forms of local banks. And you still see traces of this, you know. My heart flutters every time I go by a Bank Leumi or any of these things. There was a system of sectoral and regional banking, both in England and in Israel. But what you see overwhelmingly, is anybody here old enough to remember the film The Exorcist? It's an old film from, you know, so just The Exorcist, the key thing was 666. Those were the demonic numbers. And, you know, in England, that's exactly what we've got: 6 banks, 6 telecommunications companies. You know, there is, you know, the age of the oligarchs is really upon us. That seems to be the number. So they had a system of regional banks. That was very important. The second and perhaps more important feature was that they didn't go for nationalisation, but they went for the representation of workers on boards. So in the larger industries, steel, coal, iron, they went for 50%, but in any other company that employs more than about 250 people, a third of the members of the board that make strategy are elected by the workforce, that's directly, and then there's the systems of works councils. And what that meant is that workers had access to the knowledge of the company, first. Second, that what was actually going on in the company could be fed back into the corporate governance structure of the company. And the third is that work and workers were part of the deliberative process about the strategy and the development of the strategy of companies. So a balance of interests in corporate governance. So it wasn't just dominated by owners or by capital. And the third and really the most important thing was labour market entry. There was an explicit vocational system of labour market entry, which meant that you had to go through an apprenticeship before you could enter the workplace. Now, for approximately 35 years, the dominant discourse in America and England was that this was inefficient, it was slow, it was cumbersome, it was wrong, but that was the advantage for us, or for the West, of having communism in the East. If you look back, they were really worried about communism, so they said, okay, well, we'll let them have a few workers on the boards and we'll let them do this because it works. Now, what happened in terms of the German economy, it turned out that this system of labour value and the priority of labour value, so limiting the domination of capital, but above all, the formation and reproduction of work and labour value, turned Germany into, by quite a margin, the most effective economy in Europe. You could say a dominant economic. Now, one of the tragedies of the European Union is that the German model has not been generalised as a European system. The American English system of free movement and the subordination of institutions to competition has been so. In old Marxist or Gramscian terms, you could say that Germany is dominant without being hegemonic. You know, it hasn't succeeded in exporting its system. In fact, it's desperately trying to retain its system from being illegal according to EU laws and violations on competition. Good morning. You've reached a bad point where I'm describing the virtues of Germany. I didn't mean to do that. so early in the morning in Tel Aviv, but there we go. And so what it wasn't, I just want to stress, what it was not was a Keynesian system. So it was fiscally conservative, so money was allocated according to essentially the price system. It wasn't responding to social demands, and obviously that related to the fear of inflation that preceded the war, but had by far the greatest participation of the workforce in the economic system. In that sense, you could say that it was embedded. It had the greatest degree of constraints on its banking system. In that sense, the power of capital was constrained. And above all, it retained a human status for work. And this was within a generally decentralized, or what they call a federal economic system. So what particularly happened after the crash in 2008 was the level of debt and deficit that had been generalized in Britain was very alarming, and the level of value generated within the German economy was quite remarkable. Now, very, very, very briefly, because I know that I'm talking too long. So what we're working on is three things. The first is a different model of the economic actor. So it sounds quite straightforward, but it's proving to be quite demanding. So essentially, there's economic theory only allows of two motivations: egotism and altruism. So either people act egotistically, with self-interest narrowly conceived, or they say you act altruistically. You act, and you can see that in the model of sort of corporate social responsibility. You know, we maximise our returns in the business, and then we give. You know, and philanthropy and that sort of thing. So what we're trying to do is to develop a concept of self-interest broadly conceived. So neither altruistic nor exclusively self-interested, but a relational concept of the person that benefits from the kinds of sacrifices required to have a system that protects the human status of labour, and obviously moving that further, and can resist the exploitation also of nature. So a different form of, let's say, social anthropology in the economic model. And then what we're trying to do is bring in this to restore and renew the theory of labour value into the economy, and that's saying that labour has an external value. So competitive success is ultimately based on, good morning, is ultimately based on the quality of the labour value embedded in the product of things. So labour has an external value, and that's related to the system of skill formation, and that it also has an internal value in a Aristotelian sense, that treating human beings as human beings, allowing them some agency, giving them some power, and having institutions that protect and reproduce skill and vocation is necessary for an economy. So, I mean, the ultimate degradation, if you like, for left-wing theory and socialist theory, which I'm sure you've heard of, is human capital. Have you ever heard of this? You know, well, didn't we used to call that labour? You know, this idea of human capital is one of the strangest developments intellectually that we could ever see. So the idea is, you know, that educating people and them having some relationships with other people, it was like treated as some kind of incredible revelation, is good. That's a good thing. We like that. Having friends, that's good. You know, people having families, can you imagine? That's also, we found out in our research that that's quite good. Going to shul sometimes, but not excessively, very good. You know, that's very good. We don't want excessively, fanatical people, but it turns out that having some kind of relationship, it's really one of the weakest things that has ever appeared on the face of the earth, and it's part of a general pattern. So what have we been told generates value? Technology generates value, capital generates value, education generates value, everything generates value over the last 40 years except labour. Labour does not generate value because labour is a cost in some way. So we have to have a real attack on that theory of human capital and all the theories surrounding it, and really assert fundamentally that capital and labour are both necessary for the productive process, that work is an absolutely necessary, it'll be the first time that I've said it to you, but unfortunately it's not the first time that I've said it in my life, I say it a lot. I said, well, someone is going to have to, wipe your mother's bottom at some point, and I'm pretty sure, looking around the room, that, not here, but I say in England, it won't be you. And someone's going to have to clean the toilet, and someone's going to have to cook. That we think that there's going to be a world without work, when in fact there's an intensification of work. But we don't conceptualise it as labour. We contract it out, we do lots of moves. That means that we don't recognise the actual work that is required in society, and for some strange reason are attracted to views of a leisure society and other forms, none of which can conceivably be true. So so the labour theory of value is a central part of that, and then looking at the institutions, the decentralised institutions, the vocational institutions, reforms of the educational system in Britain that will respect work. Because what we also find is that manual work is not respected. It's almost as if the Jewish dream of the sort of 1950s has become a universal dream, where everybody becomes a doctor and everybody becomes a lawyer, and no one is a plumber and no one is a worker. It's nuts. So we want to send everybody to university. What we find out is that in England, not everybody wants to go to university. People wish to work in different ways, but there's no respect for that work. So whereas, I'll tell you a story. About 4 years ago, a Labour Party conference, I called for the closing of half the universities and the establishment of vocational colleges. And people went, ah. But then when I said that I'd put the medical schools and the law schools in the vocational colleges, people went completely insane. I mean, the next day, the front page of the Times, the front page of the Telegraph, Lord Glasman calls for doctors to go to vocational colleges. My point was, well, who actually are you? This is work. But we have this conception of professions good, vocations bad. I'm just talking about the political ways that changes, and that's got to change. And then what we argued for in terms of the decentralisation of capital, and it's just huge figures. So on September the 28th, 2008, £1.6 trillion, which is a lot of money if you do it in a conversion to Israeli currency, but certainly enough to buy me a couple of coffees on Ben Yehuda Street, but maybe not in the best places, but really a lot. I'm not huge, but a lot. £1.6 trillion was transferred overnight from the public sector to the banks because their debt levels, they're cheating. So this is what we're talking about. Is that you cannot, is that there have to be, and the second central plank in our economic theory is to give incentives to virtue rather than incentives to vice. So what we argue in the present system is that you're rewarded essentially for being unbelievably unpleasant. You're rewarded for cheating, lying, exaggerating, and being really astonishingly selfish in a way that you really wouldn't get away with in any other sphere of life. So we do a lot of work on how do you bring in incentives to virtue. The third thing that we bring in is this forms of relational accountability. That's very much rooted So that's the representation of different interests in the corporate governance, because what we realised in the banking crisis was that no one was holding them to account, that there was a homogeneity of interests and there needed to be a balance of interests, and that the best possible form of that interests were the workers. And then the importance of institutions. When I was last here, I was here 2 years ago, and I came on, it was a very different visit. I came on an official parliamentary visit. So I visited a very different place, and the place that I visited was called the Startup Nation. I don't know if you've heard of this. I visited a country called the Startup Nation, and everybody I met was involved in high tech and, you know, high politics, and it was all about innovation and all about the way that technology was being used to market. So it was a very interesting story, and the more I looked at it and the more I asked questions, the more I realised that the Israeli army was the hub of this high tech, of this startup nation. That there was a huge amount of work that went on in the army about redesigning technology that then had outlets. So there was, the relationships were formed in the army that could be used after the army for the support work for the new entrepreneurs, but a huge number of the products that were being marketed were, and it was very interesting. In the end, I kept on saying, so what goes on? In the end, it seems to me, and obviously I couldn't get it really doubly confirmed, is that intellectual copyright doesn't apply in the army. That you can take things apart and put things back together, and you can use different forms of technologies, and then, and so that's you know. So we're also working on this idea that of the forces and relations of knowledge. That knowledge itself is not a commodity. So you can see the Israeli army in a strange way as a space where knowledge is decommodified, where you look at it, you look at it in different ways. You put different kinds of things together. No one is policing intellectual copyright law, you know. So you've got the Israeli army and you've got basically China. Those are the two forces that really don't respect intellectual copyright law. And but that's a very interesting thing, because what you have under the existing capitalist is this relentless commodification of knowledge, means that there's real blocks on creativity, real blocks on how you can put new things together, which is obviously the basis of generating value. So those ideas are the balance of interest in corporate governance, incentives to virtue within the economic system of vocation, virtue and value, of the role of institutions. And there's obviously a lot more I can say. I just wanted to introduce you to these ideas with relational accountability, but the final thing that's really necessary to talk about is that if it's going to be the case that we're going to understand the virtues of capitalism, that we're going to understand the virtues of the dynamism of that we're going to have some respect for the price system, that it's not the case, you know, that if people don't want what you're telling them, that they're wrong. I mean, this is a fundamental issue, obviously, with our politics. I asked the old leader of the Labour Party why we lost the election, a guy called Neil Kinnock. You really don't need to worry about it. I'm in the House of Lords, I get this opportunity. I say, so why did we lose, Neil? And he said, because the people were lost in the miasma of false consciousness. You know, it's not going to work out at all. If we're going to do that, then we have to have a very strong organising. We've got to revive a very old Labour tradition, very old Jewish Labour tradition of Labour organising, because the other side, so I met with all the heads of the unions after the election, and their question to me was, Morris, why did the people vote against their self-interest? Which is the same way of putting the question. And when I tried to argue with them that, in fact, the people weren't moving against their self-interest, they just didn't see us as representing their self-interest. You know, they said, well, they just reverted to, but it's a proven fact that if you spend more, you save more, that if you go into more debt, you generate more value. You know, they all the old certainties. So if we're going to move to this area, then there has to be genuine leadership development from the poor. That's absolutely vital. So what we're working on parallel to this is doing leadership training so that workers know how to read a balance sheet, can participate in the corporate governance, so those things. But above all, a return of genuine organising of workers. The most successful work we did with the living wage was with cleaners, with home care workers, with basically immigrant communities who had no relationship to the labour movement but were being really exploited. But to do that, I'm just saying, you had to work in it was very different from labour movement organising, progressive, secular. The attachments that people had was very much to family, to faith. You had to work within the traditions of those people. So it's wonderful that Arne Graf is coming, because he's the master of that kind of labour organising. Anyway, I know I've spoken too long. It's lovely to be here. I just wanted to give you an introduction to the general direction of travel, that decentralised democracy and the holding of capital to account from inside the banking corporate governance system, with a recognition of incentives to virtual and relational accountability. I think that's the way in which we're going to humanise this beast, because that's ultimately, I think, the role of each generation is to constrain the domination of the rich, to constrain the domination of capital through the leadership of the poor. And we thought we could do it through the administration of the state, but that was a delusion. But thank you.
So, hi. I don't know how you're all doing. Time for a cigarette for Morris. So you want me to talk for 5 minutes while I take a quick cigarette break? So on two fronts. One is the English, right? Yeah. And it's not Americanism. It's actually good English. So that's. I was sitting there going. It's actually English. I was sitting there going, wow. That's what the mother country sounds like. So that's number one. And number two is, I think, I'll say from my perspective, is the economics. And I think one of our goals for this morning is just like the beginning, is I think we really have a very, very, very poor economic conversation. I think that, I know for myself, I think I'm pretty good at this stuff by this point. Like I understand it, I get it, I follow it. But I think in general, like when I look for people to talk to I think that we're all isolated in these little places that ask a very small set of questions. So I really appreciate the attempt to put out, what Morris defined as a political economy. What does this thing look like? What's the alternative that we're searching for? And so I'd love to have a conversation on all levels, No question, any question on any kind of level that goes through, any comments, but let's take advantage of the opportunity and not be shy and, see if we can get somewhere in the conversation. So, opening up.
I have this effect.
Yeah. Ofer.
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. The one thing that I would like to ask you to focus on would be the rise of old labor now in England. Jeremy Corbyn has been elected, and to what I understand and know, he's not talking the way you are talking. And he was elected in a landslide, and so I would be very honest to hear about it.
I mean, these things will pass. As they say, that used to be the name of a really bad progressive rock album in the 70s. These things will pass. It's just, I'll give you two ways of answering the question. The first is that when I used to be working in community organising, one of the things was, it was a very odd thing to happen to a Jewish person. I used to get called in a lot to churches which were declining. So just spare a thought. I didn't say this yesterday, so I'll say this today. You know, things have changed. We've got to spare a thought for the Christians now. They get slaughtered in Iraq, and no one's there to save them. You know, they're the new Jews. But anyway, let's put that on one side. I used to get called into these churches, and they say, we don't understand it. We're declining. The number of people coming to church is declining, but there's this real upsurge in these charismatic healing services. And they couldn't make the connection between the two. That as the more of the charismatic healing services and the young, you know, people getting themselves healed and speaking in tongues, the more ordinary people walked away. I just share that that is an image of the Labour Party. So the more we decline, the more prey we are to being captured by the charismatic. And the second is I take complete responsibility for it. I've really enjoyed myself a lot. I've met Alon, done quite a lot of moving around, but we had no candidate. We didn't develop this strongly enough. So the price of a successful politics is a constructive alternative. What Jeremy Corbyn represents is completely the assertion of 1970s Labour orthodoxy. Spending, no reform of welfare, the complete critique of neoliberalism. And as he was elected by a landslide within a very strange system, you could, sometimes I reflect on it. I wrote this piece, didn't go down very well. I said, not since Jacob and Esau did anybody sell their birthright so cheaply as the Labour Party for £3, which is the equivalent of a coffee on Ben Yehuda Street. You could vote in this election. So essentially we got the far left. And there are about, in England, it's a bigger country than here, there are in total about 500,000 really hard left people in the country, most of them employed in the unions, academia and the public sector. And they all joined. So this is a crisis of relationships, but as the position is there, Labour sinks lower and lower in public opinion. That's why I say it won't last. So our job is to hold our nerve and to intensify the work so that we can present. The problem we've got is people say to me, so you don't agree with big public spending, and you don't agree with big welfare spending, and you don't want to nationalise the economy, you're a Tory. That's the dominant thing. So I think we've got to definitely be able to talk about this as a genuine resistance to the domination of capital, and that we didn't do enough. So what I would say is, the weird thing is, since the election there's been a huge intensification of interest in this work. So I think, politics, Machiavelli said, politics is the ability to act in time. It's not yet our time, is what I would say. But I'm not in any way concerned by the Corbyn. Corbyn is just what happens in every organisation when there's a fundamental existential threat. They revert to the old orthodoxy. So it's the last gasp of the old orthodoxy. But the people aren't there. The people of the country are nowhere near. And so that's where we are. Please, and what's your name, sir?
Hi everyone. My name is Netta Gruber. I work with the Tel Aviv municipality. We are actually the ones who take these innovation tours that you were talking about 8,200 the special units in the army that help bring out the talent. So I thought that was really interesting. And I want to take you back to your comment on human resources and labor, which I found very interesting. And what we talk about is we talk about talent, which is, again, talking about people, but their added value, or maybe, as the way I view it, less what they're capable of, like their capabilities, and they're more in kind of their characteristics or their interests or what they can bring, what value they can bring to the table. So I wanted to get your thoughts on whether this was just a matter of terminology, labor, human resources, and talent, or was this offering maybe a different point of view in that respect?
Fantastic. That's no, it's fundamental. So just that you know a bit more about myself. So I come from a show business family. That's the family business was show business, and so that was what my family were involved with, and really the talent. So talent spotting is essentially now another word for talent spotting in political terms is leadership development. You make a judgment about a person, and then you support that person in various ways. That's the commitment, and you live and die by those commitments. So in terms of politics, you know, that's the thing with union organising. You walk into a church or you walk into a workplace, and the talent that I had was to work out who were the leaders in that place. So the first is talent is leader. If talent has followers, that's the crucial thing. And then you make a decision about whether, you know, what is the talent of that person and the distinctiveness of that person. So it's the opposite of human resources. It's not making that person conform to existing management patterns. It's developing the follower, the followers, the person as a leader.
It's also different from labor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. So in terms of union organising, which I was talking about, you know, the first thing is you've got to have leaders from within the workforce, and then we've got things that we can teach. You know, that's what I used to do in community organising. Then you work on how to negotiate, how to make a speech, how to build your following. You know, those things. So talent and leadership are very closely connected, and nothing happens without those things. That's the, if you don't have talent and leadership, then what you have is meetings. More and more meetings, more and more emails, more and more death. And so the point is that talent, if you support talent, it creates trouble. And that's the dilemma, because it changes the balance of power in any given situation. Yeah. So stick with the and that's the other thing. When I was here last time with the army, is the, you know, there was an understanding about leadership, supporting, and an understanding that the definition. I don't know if any of you heard of Gordon Brown. He used to be Prime Minister of Britain. A very unhappy and troubled man. And he called me into his office when I was early, and because I was saying that there was no leadership at the poor. There was no talent spotting, essentially. So when I came to Israel, I was 70 years ago, I don't hear the word anymore particularly. All I ever heard was protexia. That there was this system that gave jobs to the children of the elites, and there was nothing anybody could do about this system. And essentially, you know, Labour in England became a party that, you know, that just gave jobs to Oxford graduates and, you know, people, you know, it was a protexia system, and there was no leadership of the poor. So that's what I was going crazy about. And Gordon Brown called me into number 10 Downing Street. It was my first ever time that I went there. And I know I'm asking you about films. Anybody seen Shrek? The movie Shrek? Well, he looked like that. And he was sitting there, you know, big, short, ogre. And he says, so what is your definition of leadership? You know, really aggressively. And I said, well, someone with followers. You know. Oh my God, the silence, the Scottish silence, like, you know. I've got a view of psychosomatic illness. I had flu for a week, you know, I was just knocked out. So, the point being, the really important point being, is that there was no leadership. There was just administration of the party system. Nobody was causing any. There was no innovation. There was no trouble. You just waited your turn until you moved into the next phase. So, talent and the idea of leaders having followers. I think we have a big problem on this on the left. Is that you can see very clearly that there are right-wing leaders who have real followers. I don't know how many people would follow Yitzhak Herzog without being paid. You know, I'm just asking. You don't know. You just don't know. You don't know if they really would get up in the morning and really fight for it. That's so. Just saying talent is everything, but it's leadership, it's followers, it's creativity. That's the judgments that have to be made, and I think it's much better than thinking in terms of career development and human resources.
So that's the sort of question. You think could explain very briefly what happened to the third way? What went wrong? Because in the 19th it was like the prophecy. Everyone was circling around Anthony Giddens, the third way, and some reason it evaporated.
Yeah, well, there's reasons.
Yeah,
there's real reasons. So let's just say that it didn't have a political economy at all. It had no real analysis of capitalism. It accepted in an incredibly uncritical way globalization. You know, that there was this form of so essentially it was, in an odd way, a re-expression of the post-war settlement in a global era. So what you would have was the growth of corporate capitalism, and then you would have the strengthening of the EU, the strengthening of the UN, and a form of global welfare and regulation. So, without wanting to sound like a really sectarian, horrible person, but I am a really sectarian, horrible person, so it's hard not to sound like one. It was an astonishingly superficial theory. And what happened to it was it worked really well for about a decade as social democratic parties and the American Democratic Party could answer the question of what would you do about the economy. This offer absolutely relates. What could you do about the economy? We accept it. We accept globalization, we accept free trade, we accept the dominion of capital, except we're going to tax higher, and we're going to, in some way, regulate within a system of sort of international structures. So a very administrative system. And so what essentially has happened is you've got the domination of capital. It's got no means of explaining why that leads and how that leads to right-wing populism. It's got no means of understanding how that leads to the centralisation of capital and people becoming poorer. So it essentially was incapable, in the end, once the initial novelty wore off, it was incapable of acting in the world. It was incapable of explaining what was going on or of acting in the world. He's in the House of Lords with me. He's a Tottenham supporter. So the weird things about my relationship with Anthony Giddens is that now all we talk about is football, because any conversation on politics really goes, very wrong.
My name is Ran. If we go back to this junction after the war between England and West Germany, if I understood right, you suggested it's about the democratize the production process. Is it still the point today? Do you think is it still relevant? This model, of course, if maybe we have to adjust it, but is it still relevant to our days?
Yeah, so that's key. So when it comes to the representation of the workforce on the boards, when it comes to the vocational system, and when it comes to the banking system, nothing's changed in Germany. So, and it remains, you know, the economic driving force. And so what you have, there's slightly different systems in Holland, in Denmark, you know, but they're strangely comparable. That's the way they've moved into a system where there's a very, very strong price system. They work within a competitive capitalist economy in the production of things with very intense systems of vocational reproduction with the representation of the workforce on the board. Yeah, so it's relevant twice over. It's relevant still in terms of the economic system, but for me obviously it's also relevant as a way of thinking in comparative economic terms about how we organise our economy. So yeah, that's astonishing though what happened. Only Germany, isn't it? That you could, in England, if anybody did anything like they did at Volkswagen, they'd go straight to the Guardian. The work, I mean, it would be leaked. I still find it amazing that they can get away with an industrial deceit, with everybody participating in the deceit. I just share that with you as a cultural reflection. Yeah. You know.
I'm Boaz. And I wanted to ask, being a graduate, I guess you could say, of a leadership program and going into an elite cyber army unit, probably,
right.
You know, all
you'll end up making labour after all.
I just, a question that was often raised there and raised to myself was, how do you measure the effectivity of such things, of leadership programs at all, or talent searching things, or whatever it is? How do you find a way to see that it's actually working? I'd like your opinion.
Okay, so do you have a phrase? This I couldn't possibly say in Hebrew. The proof is in the pudding? No? Okay, so I'll try a different thing. Time. So essentially, you know, with leadership training, the only way that you can measure whether it's effective is whether the people that you trained did things. So that's it. That's it. So with the living wage stuff, you know, we just kept on winning it, and we kept on developing the leaders who would go on. Now there's a point after, this is important for your thing, is that so you train up, you know, a Nigerian cook who's been contracted out, and she goes and does this negotiation, and then they offer her a job in management. I mean, that's a kind of success. I used to say that's you know, there's a limited, like, you know, people do things and then they change their class position. So all we ever did was we put a lot into training not that many people. It's an expensive thing, it takes your time, and then the only thing you can look at is whether they maintain their following. What we noticed with a lot of other leadership programs was that they stopped being leaders and they started being managers, and you know, so we work within the experience of your people, work outside the experience of your opponents. The action is in the reaction. You know, it was a lot of just putting them out there. So that's what I would say. So I've got a huge skepticism about a lot of leadership programs. I think that they stop people being, and start them becoming sort of, you know, like Gordon Brown, that conversation when he said, what do you think a leader is? He said, no, a leader is not someone with followers. A leader is someone who challenges their followers. So I said, that is exactly why you'll lose, you know. And so he did,
Yes. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Around. So I've got one.
Good.
Short. You kind of alluded to it, but.
I was just going to say one thing to people. I've got this, but it's really not your problem. It's mine. I've got a bit of a bad back. So do you mind if I stand up?
Go for it.
Thank you.
So translating this into the 5 things that, or 10 things, or 3 things, or 7 things, but things, policies that you would say these are examples of the kind of policies that need to change in England, that we want to push through, that will point to the public and say, this is something different, this is what we mean, and that they would, it would help to embody what the argument is.
You're looking for policy position.
I am.
Hello.
Sorry.
So early in the
Can we do it with the mic?
Yeah. Okay. So usually, just to share with you before I answer Elon's questions, always politics before policy. And always remember that culture eats policy for breakfast. So just to let you know where we're at and what we're working on. So the first thing is vocational training. Very strong emphasis. Changing the educational system so that there's pathways at 14 so that people can pursue that vocational. Workers on the boards. That's a huge one. We're looking for the representation of 1/3 of the seats on any boards. We're also doing this, by the way, with football clubs, that the supporters can go on the boards. That was very popular. One, so workers on the boards, the 10% of the bailout, remember I mentioned that 1.6 trillion, well 10% of that to endow regional banks under the supervision of the Bank of England, called the Banks of England. So we're looking on that, and then, in relation to the trade union movement, we're really pushing for a real move of their resources away from grievance procedures towards leadership training, a genuine leadership training of the poor. And I've just got to share with everybody that that poor people who should be our leaders don't like us very much, and they do respect their tradition and their faith. So a real working, a reconciliation between faith and labour in order to resist the domination of capital. So those things that I would say, vocational training, regional banks, workers on boards, very strong stress on leadership training, and building a broad-based coalition to resist the domination of capital. That's where I would be at. I didn't mean to do that standing up. It was just a backlash.
It was good. Last questions? What's the path to success? Last question.
Well, okay. Now you make me sit down. There's 3 levels of work. This completely relates to your question. First of all, what we inherited in Britain, a political leadership in Parliament that are the product of the protexia system. So they're not leaders. So the first thing is a genuine talent spotting and leadership development within Parliament. So relationships, building those relationships. The second is this work that I presented today. That's related to, you could call this chapter 1, but there's got to be a. So here's the thing. If I say to you, so my mum used to say to me, and these are very difficult idioms to translate, where there's a will, there's a way. Have you heard of that one? Yeah, where it's a bit like, so I've inverted it, only where there's a way is there a will. Right, so we've got to work on not the third way, but the way, a different way of organising, a different way. That's why this political economy piece, so there's real intellectual work to be done. And then there's just the the organising. The point being is that this stuff is very, the people are already there. They want something that's conservative and radical. They want to resist the domination of the banks, but they don't want to be dominated by the state. They respect religion, but don't want to be dominated by that either. You know, this broad-based thing is very popular. So the way to success, I would say, is for us to understand that we do know things. We know that capital leads to commodification. We know that no politics can be successful without the leadership of the poor. We know a lot. So to be that paradoxical thing, we've got to be determined but humble. We've got to open up to people and build those relationships on the ground with people who really think that we don't like them and don't listen to them and don't think we have anything to learn from them. So those three things. Other than that, it's going to be easy.
It sounds so wildly familiar. And on that front, why don't we take a break and we'll meet again in about 15 minutes or so. And thank you so much. And we'll continue. Next session, we'll hear from Moriss again during the coffee break while he's standing up and stretching his back.
So if I'm standing up, that's